Radford Ashby had not spoken in 4 minutes. He sat on his horse at the gate of a small ranch on the Powder River, holding a lead rope attached to 8 bulls, and he could not find the words for what he had come to say. The morning air was so cold that every breath he exhaled rose in a cloud and vanished into the gray sky above him, and the only sound on the entire prairie was the occasional shift of a hoof in frozen snow and the slow, patient breathing of 8 animals that had no idea they were all that remained of an empire. 5 months ago, he had stood on this same ground and called the structure behind the gate an expensive coffin for sheep. He had said it loudly in front of his foreman and a journalist from the Cheyenne Tribune, and the words had traveled across the territory in saddlebags and mail pouches until every rancher from Casper to Sheridan had heard them and laughed. The story had run in the newspaper under a headline that made people smile over their morning coffee. The woman who owned this place had become a kind of joke, a cautionary tale about foreign stubbornness and misplaced sentiment, and Ashby had been pleased to consider himself the man who had named the joke correctly. Now he was back, and the barn he had mocked was breathing. Warm vapor rose from the seams of the doorframe and curled into the frozen air the way smoke curls from a chimney on a still morning. Except there was no chimney. There was no fire of any kind inside those walls. There was only wool packed into the cavities between 2 skins of cottonwood plank and the body heat of animals, and somehow in the coldest winter that anyone alive had ever witnessed that had been enough. The 8 bulls behind Ashby were all that remained of 4,000 head of cattle. The rest were dead on the open range, frozen where they stood buried under snow so deep that it would take 50 men working through the spring just to count and burn the carcasses. The financial losses would eventually be calculated in the tens of millions of dollars. The banks that had lent money against cattle that no longer existed would fail in chains across 3 territories. The Eastern investors who had funded the great ranching enterprises would pull their capital from the West and refuse to return. All of that was still coming. Ashby did not know it yet. He only knew that his mouth would not form the sentence he had ridden 4 miles through chest-deep snow to deliver, and that the woman standing 30 feet away watching him from the barn door was not going to make it easier for him. She was simply waiting the way a person waits for weather. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Mrs. Montrose, he finally managed, I do not know how to ask this. She already knew. She had known since the moment she saw him coming across the white prairie with his last 8 bulls. She opened the gate without another word. That moment was the end of a story that had begun 18 months earlier in a different season when a widow from Minnesota stepped off a freight wagon into the most beautiful and terrifying landscape she had ever seen. Sigrid Montrose arrived in the Powder River country in the spring of 1885, carrying a Sami wool comb, a leather satchel of seeds, and a quiet determination that her neighbors would mistake for foreign stubbornness for nearly 2 full years. She was 34 years old. She had been a widow for 13 months, and she had crossed half a continent to claim 60 acres of grazing land on the strength of nothing more than a homestead certificate, and the conviction that what had kept her family alive on the Finnmark Plateau would keep her alive in Wyoming. Her husband Anders had died of pneumonia in the Minnesota winter of 1884, leaving her with a small inheritance and a household that dissolved within 6 months. His sister had remarried quickly, and the new husband had made it quietly but unmistakably clear that there was no longer room in the cabin for an extra woman. So Sigrid had taken her share of the savings, sold the milk cow, and bought passage on the Northern Pacific Railroad as far as Miles City. From there, she arranged a freight wagon to carry her south into the territory where land was still being given away to anyone willing to break it. The country she found in Wyoming was beautiful in a way that frightened her. The grass ran to the horizon in waves of blue and green, and the sky pressed down with a weight she had never experienced in the close valleys of her childhood. There were no trees worth speaking of, no neighbors within shouting distance, and no protection of any kind from a wind that seemed to begin somewhere in the Bighorn Mountains and stop only when it reached the Mississippi. She staked her claim along a small creek that ran year-round, built a sod dugout for her first summer, and began the slow work of learning what this country would and would not give her. Before she left Minnesota, a letter had arrived from Anders' parents. They were sending Leland Anders' 16-year-old son from his first marriage to live with her by autumn. The boy has no one else, the letter said. We are too old. His mother's people will not take him. You are the only option remaining. Sigrid had not spent much time with Leland. The boy had lived with his grandparents since his own mother died, and he had always regarded Sigrid as the foreign woman his father had married late in life, a replacement he had never asked for and did not particularly want. But Anders had asked her in the last coherent conversation they ever had to look after the boy if something happened. She had promised. And Sigrid Montrose kept her promises the way she kept her livestock completely. By the autumn of 1885, she had purchased a small flock of 40 sheep from a Basque herder, leaving the territory for California, along with 2 milk cows, a dozen chickens, and a mule named Corbin, that she had paid too much for and would never regret owning. Wyoming in 1885 was cattle country, and cattle country meant open range, which meant that any rancher worth his salt drove his herd onto public grass in May and left them there until October, then turned them loose for the winter to fend for themselves on whatever grass they could paw out from beneath the snow. The whole economy of the territory rested on the assumption that range cattle were tough enough to survive without shelter, and that any rancher who wasted lumber-building barns for his stock was either a fool or a sentimentalist who had not learned how the West actually worked. Sigrid had grown up differently. Her grandmother on her mother's side had been born among the reindeer herders of the Finnmark Plateau, where winter ran from October through May and temperatures regularly fell far below zero for weeks at a time. Sigrid had spent her childhood summers at her grandmother's home, the traditional winter dwelling, learning the careful science of how a people survived in a place where cold was not an event, but a condition, a permanent fact of existence that could not be fought with brute force. The Sami did not build enormous fires and pile on furs and hope to outlast the cold through sheer combustion of fuel. They had learned across 1,000 years of trial and death and refinement to work with the physics of trapped air and fibrous insulation, to understand that the difference between life and death in a Finnmark blizzard was not how much heat you could generate, but how little heat you could afford to lose. And the foundation of everything they knew about staying warm was wool. Not just any wool, but the raw, greasy fleece that came off a sheep before any washing or carding fleece, still saturated with lanolin, in which the natural crimp of each fiber created billions of tiny air pockets that no other material on Earth could match. A single fiber of raw wool is hollow at its core. It traps air inside itself and between itself and every neighboring fiber. It absorbs moisture without losing its insulating power. It will not burn easily. It will not rot quickly. It will not pack down flat the way straw or sawdust eventually does. A pound of wool properly placed was worth 10 pounds of any other material humans had ever invented for keeping cold at bay. Sigrid remembered the summer she was 9 years old, standing inside her grandmother's home, while the old woman pressed her small hand against the wall. The wall was soft and warm, packed tight with raw fleece between inner and outer layers. Her grandmother pushed her hand in gently and watched how the wool responded. If it gives a little and springs back, her grandmother said, the density is right. If your hand sinks deep without resistance, there is not enough wool. If the surface feels hard and will not yield, you have packed it too tight and killed the air inside. Then she lifted Sigrid's hand away and watched the wool slowly return to its original shape. This is not about believing the wool will work, the old woman said. This is about knowing it will work. Believing and knowing are two different things. Then she looked at her granddaughter with the particular directness of very old people who have stopped wasting time on indirection. The cold does not negotiate, she said. Only your physics answers it. Remember this not as a lesson. Remember it as a law. Sigrid had carried that law across the Atlantic and across the continent. When she stood on her Wyoming claim that first autumn and felt the wind cut through her coat, as if the fabric were not there, she knew immediately that any structure she built for her animals would have to follow the principles her grandmother had taught her. The cottonwood logs available for construction were soft and porous and chinked poorly. Sod worked for a small dugout, but could not serve for a livestock barn that needed proper ventilation and dry footing. And the standard cattleman's approach, which was no shelter at all, would mean watching her sheep freeze to death the first time the temperature dropped far enough. So Sigrid built differently. She began in the spring of 1886, as soon as the ground had thawed enough to dig post holes, and she worked through every dry day for the next 7 months. She laid out the foundation as a rectangle 30 feet by 20, with stone footings dug deep into the ground to prevent frost heave. She framed the walls with double rows of cottonwood studs, an outer row, and an inner row separated by an 8-inch cavity with horizontal blocking every 4 feet to keep the cavity stable. The roof was a low-pitch shed style just steep enough to shed snow with deep eaves and a continuous ridge vent disguised as a simple cupboard. She built each door as a sandwich of inner and outer plank skins separated by a core of wool batting. She fitted each door with a wool felt gasket that compressed when the door closed, sealing the opening tight against drafts. She built a small vestibule at the main entrance with 2 sets of doors so that cold air could never penetrate directly into the main barn space. And she paid particular attention to the floor, laying a base of broken stone for drainage, then a layer of wool felt, then heavy planks on floor joists, then straw bedding on top. The total floor assembly measured nearly 14 inches from frozen ground to the surface where her sheep would stand. The whole framework was conventional enough that nobody questioned it during the early phases. But as summer progressed and Sigrid began filling that 8-inch wall cavity, the questions started. She drove her wagon into the small settlement of Crooked Creek twice a month through June and July, returning each time with a load of raw fleece purchased from the Wyoming Wool Growers Cooperative. The cooperative had a warehouse at the railhead where unsold fleece accumulated during shearing season, and Sigrid had negotiated a price of 3 cents per pound for the lower grades that were difficult to ship east. She bought 400 pounds the first month, another 400 the second, and by the end of July, she had nearly 1,200 pounds of greasy, unwashed wool stacked around her construction site. She tamped each handful into the wall cavity with a flat wooden paddle she had made herself, pressing and packing until the wool achieved the density her grandmother had taught her to recognize by feel. Not too loose or it would settle over time and leave cold gaps. Not too tight or the compressed fibers would lose the very air pockets that gave them their insulating value. She checked every section of every wall by hand before nailing up the inner sheathing. Silas Hartwell was the first neighbor to express his opinion, and he expressed it loudly. Hartwell ran 400 head of cattle on the range north of Sigrid's claim, and he considered himself the unofficial spokesman for proper ranching practice in the area. He had spent 6 winters on the high plains and regarded this record as proof that the open range system was fundamentally sound and that anyone who deviated from it was either ignorant or insane. He rode over to Sigrid's place in late July, sat his horse for 10 minutes watching her work, then finally dismounted and walked toward her with the air of a man who had made up his mind to be helpful regardless of whether help was wanted. He pulled a handful of wool from the unsheathed section of the wall. He held it up to his nose, turned his face away, and dropped it back into the cavity with the deliberate disgust of a man making a point. "Mrs. Montrose," he said, "what in the name of all that is holy do you think you are doing with this wool?" Sigrid wiped her forehead with the back of her wrist and looked up at him without stopping her work. "Filling the wall," she said. "The cavity needs material and wool fills it well." "Wool is for shipping," Hartwell said. "Wool is money. The mice will nest in it by Christmas and the moths will breed in it by spring. You will have wasted $300 on something that any sensible woman would have sold to the buyers at Cheyenne." "The wool I am buying is off-grade fleece," Sigrid said. "The buyers at Cheyenne will not pay for it. The cooperative is glad to sell it to me at 3 cents because otherwise it sits in the warehouse until the rats get it." Hartwell waved this off. "My cattle have wintered on this range for 6 years," he said. "They eat snow when there is no water. They paw down to grass under 3 feet of drift. Tough animals need a windbreak and good range in the good Lord's mercy, and that has been enough for every rancher between here and the Yellowstone." He did not leave when this argument produced no visible effect on Sigrid's behavior. Instead, he stood there for another minute, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something that was not quite a threat and not quite a warning, but occupied the uncomfortable territory between them. "Mrs. Montrose, I am going to be honest with you. People around here are already talking. Not just about the wool, about you. A widow alone buying strange materials, building something nobody understands. You need friends in this valley more than you need a fancy barn." Sigrid looked up at him then. She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you for the advice, Mr. Hartwell," she said. Then she went back to work. He waited. She did not add anything. Eventually, he got back on his horse and rode north. That evening, alone in her dugout, she opened the leather-bound ledger she had kept since Minnesota and wrote by lamplight. "Hartwell is not wrong that I need friends. But friends built on silence are not friends. They are a different kind of trap. She closed the ledger and blew out the lamp. The geese arrived in the second week of September, or rather they left. Sigrid was standing in the yard when she saw them, a formation of Canada geese larger than any she had seen in Minnesota, more than 200 birds moving south against a pale morning sky. It was not unusual for geese to migrate south in autumn. It was unusual for them to be doing it on the 8th of September, 3 weeks earlier than any September she could remember. And it was more unusual still when halfway across the sky above her, the entire formation banked hard to the east. Not a gradual drift, but a decisive turn, as if every bird in the flock had received the same instruction at the same moment and chosen not to argue with it. She stood watching until they disappeared behind the ridge to the east. She did not mention it to anyone. She went inside and wrote in her ledger, "Geese early, they turned east. They know something I do not." Then she went back to work. Reverend Abner arrived on a Sunday afternoon in late August, dismounting at her gate with the careful deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed what he intended to say. He was 52 years old, lean, with a voice that carried the particular resonance of decades in front of congregations. He was the only minister within 50 miles, and he carried the moral weight of that position, the way other men carry tools as something useful and appropriate to have on one's person at all times. He walked around the barn for several minutes, examining the wool-packed walls without touching them. Then he came to stand beside Sigrid and spoke in the quiet, measured tone of someone sharing a concern, not delivering a judgment. "I understand your methods come from the Lapp people, Mrs. Montrose," he said, "from your grandmother." He used the word Lapp. Sigrid felt it land the way a small stone lands in still water, not loudly but with an expanding effect. It was the word that outsiders use for the Sami, and it carried with it a freight of condescension that Reverend Abner may or may not have intended. "From my grandmother," Sigrid said simply. Reverend Abner nodded. He said that the people of this territory had built their livelihoods on the understanding that the Lord provides for his creatures. That cattle are strong, that sheep carry wool on their backs for a reason. When we go beyond what is natural, when we pamper livestock, beyond the provisions the Almighty has already made, we may be expressing a lack of trust in his design. Sigrid felt the blood rise in her face, not at the argument which she had considered from every angle, but at the target. Reverend Abner was not criticizing her method. He was questioning the source. He was suggesting that the knowledge her grandmother had carried from the Finnmark Plateau, knowledge refined across 1,000 years of survival, was somehow evidence of insufficient faith. "Reverend," she said, and her voice was steady even though her hands were not. "My grandmother believed in God. She believed he created wool so that people and animals could survive in places where survival should not have been possible. She considered it a sin to waste what he provided." Reverend Abner smiled. It was the smile of a man who has heard a child say something clever, but ultimately beside the point. He touched the brim of his hat, mounted his horse, and rode away. Sigrid stood in the yard and watched him go. The dust from his horse's hooves settled back onto the road and disappeared. The damage did not come immediately. It came the way water moves through a crack in stone, slowly and in every direction. 2 weeks later, Sigrid drove her wagon to Crooked Creek for supplies and found that Mrs. Hutchins at the dry goods counter, a woman who had always greeted her with ordinary neighborly warmth, did not look up when she entered. It was Josephine Holloway who found her at the far end of the store and spoke quietly into her ear. "Reverend Abner told the Hutchins family that your methods come from pagan traditions," Josephine said. "That is the word going around now. Not just eccentric, pagan." Sigrid stood still for a moment. Then she bought what she needed and drove home. Leland Montrose arrived in the middle of August on a freight wagon, carrying a single trunk, and an expression that suggested he had already decided this arrangement was temporary. He was 16 years old, thin, in the way that boys are thin when they have grown 6 inches in a year, and their bodies have not yet caught up, and he addressed Sigrid as Mrs. Montrose with a formality that was not politeness but distance. He stood in the yard and looked at the half-finished barn, and at the piles of raw wool, and at the woman who was supposedly responsible for him. And the first thing he said was, "My father would never have done this." Sigrid studied him for a moment. She saw Anders in his jaw and in the set of his shoulders, and she felt something complicated move through her chest. "Help me with the far corner," she said, and held out the wooden paddle. Leland did not take it. He turned and walked toward the creek without another word. The pattern established itself over the weeks that followed. Every morning, Leland rode to Hartwell's ranch, where the men treated him with rough kindness and taught him to count cattle from horseback and showed him what they called the real work of the territory. Hartwell gave the boy his first cowboy hat and told him stories about the open range that made it sound like the only honest way a man could live. Leland came home in the evening smelling like horses and leather and spoke to Sigrid only when necessary. He was not cruel. He was simply absent, and the absence was its own kind of message. In the third week of September, Leland came back from Hartwell's place in the late afternoon and stood in the doorway of the dugout and said what Sigrid had been dreading since the day he arrived. "You are making us a joke," he said. "Every person in this territory is laughing at us. My father was an American. He would be ashamed." He did not finish the sentence, but Sigrid heard it anyway in the space he left behind it. She walked past him without speaking. She went down to the creek and stood on the bank in the long September light, and for the first time since she had come to Wyoming, she wept. Not because Leland was right, not because she doubted her grandmother. She wept because she heard her dead husband in every syllable the boy had spoken, and the distance between the man Anders had been and the man his son was becoming felt like a canyon opening in the ground beneath her. She stayed at the creek until the light was almost gone. Then she walked back to the dugout, sat down at the table, and opened her ledger. If Anders were alive, he would understand, she wrote. But Anders is gone, and his son does not yet know what he does not know. Radford Ashby arrived in the second week of September with two of his foremen and a young journalist named Willa Utterback, who was visiting from the Cheyenne Tribune. Ashby was the largest cattleman in the Powder River Basin, running 4,000 head across a range so vast that it took 3 days to ride from one boundary to the other. He had made the trip specifically to see the structure that everyone in the territory was talking about. He examined Sigrid's barn for the better part of an hour, asking pointed questions about the construction and the cattlemen. Then he delivered his assessment with the confidence of a man who had absolutely no idea that his words would return to him 5 months later, like a judgment he had written against himself. "Mrs. Montrose," Ashby said, "you have built yourself a very expensive coffin for sheep. When the first hard winter comes, you will discover that all the wool in Wyoming cannot save an animal that has been pampered out of its natural toughness." Willa Utterback wrote everything down. She was 28 years old, one of the very few women working as journalists in the territory, and she had been assigned to write a feature about ranch life in the Powder River country. Ashby's quote was too good to leave out. After Ashby and his foreman departed, Willa lingered. She stood with Sigrid at the barn door and asked questions that were different from Ashby's questions, designed not to confirm something she already believed, but to understand something she did not. "Mrs. Montrose," Willa said, "I am going to write this story. I want to be honest with you. My editor wants the angle about the unusual immigrant woman, not the angle about insulation science. If I write it the way he wants it, will not be entirely fair to you." Sigrid looked at her and saw something she recognized, a woman caught between what she knew was true and what the men around her would allow her to say. "Write what you need to write," Sigrid said. "The wool does not need anyone to believe in it in order to work." Willa nodded slowly. She was still writing in her notebook when she left. But Ashby was not finished. He came back alone half an hour after Willa had ridden away, without his foreman and without the public performance of the first visit. He stopped his horse at the gate and looked at Sigrid across the yard with an expression that was not cruelty exactly, but something colder than cruelty, which is the certainty that one is about to win. "You know the council meets in February," he said. "I have friends there. If this winter does not prove your barn necessary, I will make sure the territory never sees another one built like it. Fire hazard, that is what I will tell them. Wool in the walls too close to the animals, too close to any lamp or lantern. I have the votes, Mrs. Montrose. I want you to understand that clearly." He did not wait for an answer. He turned his horse and rode away. Sigrid stood at the gate for a long moment. She was thinking about time, about February, which was 4 months away, about what it would mean to be right and unheard, which was a different kind of defeat than being simply wrong. Hosea Coldwater had already warned her Ashby had connections to the territorial legislature and the cattle associations in Cheyenne. If he decided to make her barn a political matter, he had the power to do it. There was nothing she could do except wait and build and hope that the winter itself would say what no argument could. There was one person who had not laughed at her. Hosea Coldwater was a northern Cheyenne man who lived with his wife and 2 children on a parcel of land 6 miles south of Sigrid's claim. He raised horses and a small herd of cattle and worked seasonally as a freighter between Crooked Creek and the agency. He had ridden past Sigrid's place several times during the summer construction, and unlike every white rancher who had commented on the wool walls, he had simply watched and said nothing. In late September, he stopped at the barn while Sigrid was installing the last of the interior fittings. He stood inside the empty stable for a long time, moving from section to section, studying the structure, the way a craftsman studies another craftsman's work, not looking for flaws but reading the decisions. He examined the way the double walls were framed. He looked at the ridge vent along the peak of the roof, following with his eyes the path that moisture would travel upward and out of the building, while warmer air remained trapped below. He knelt down and pressed his boot against the floor assembly, feeling for the solidity beneath the surface. Then he stood and spoke in the slightly formal English he had learned at the agency school. "This is built well," he said. "My grandmother's people, when they made winter lodges, they used buffalo robes the same way you have used the wool, two skins with material between them. The material held the air still. The still air kept the heat." He paused. "My father lost 200 horses in the winter of 1862, he said. "The Indian Bureau had forbidden our people from building lodges the old way. Made us use log houses. The log houses could not hold heat the way our lodges did. The horses died. They said it was God's will." Sigrid heard the echo of Reverend Abner's words in that last sentence. The same argument used against different people across 2 decades with the same result. "Your grandmother and my grandmother would have understood each other," Coldwater said. Sigrid felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for months. "Yes," she said. He was the only person in the territory who told her that her work made sense. She found that this single voice of recognition was enough to sustain her through the continuing mockery of everyone else. 2 weeks later, the Cheyenne Tribune published its story under the headline, "Norwegian Widow Builds Sheep Hotel on Powder River." The article was not openly cruel, but it was amused in the way a cat is amused by something small and helpless, and copies traveled across the territory until nearly every rancher between Casper and Sheridan had an opinion about the strange wool barn and the foreign woman who built it. Then Josephine Holloway came in October with a jar of preserved peaches and a gentle warning. Josephine was the closest thing Sigrid had to a friend in the territory, and she toured the barn with genuine interest before she said as carefully as she could that her husband believed Sigrid had been ill-advised. 8 years on this range, Josephine said, and they had never lost an animal because they did not pack their walls with wool. Then she added more quietly, "Leland came to our place last week. The boy's unhappy. He says he is ashamed." Sigrid thanked her for the peaches and the honesty and offered no defense. That night, lying in the loft she had built above the barn's tack room, listening to the wind find every seam in the roof and fail to penetrate any of them, Sigrid allowed herself for the first time to consider the possibility that she was wrong. She opened her ledger and wrote by lamplight. "If this winter is mild, if the cold does not come the way grandmother described, then everyone is right and I have wasted everything. The money, the months of labor, and whatever chance I had of making Leland see me as something other than the foreign woman who built a hotel for sheep." She lay in the dark for a long time after that, feeling the doubt work through her. Then she remembered her grandmother's voice, steady and precise as a compass bearing. "This is not about believing the wool will work. This is about knowing it will work. Believing and knowing are 2 different things. The cold does not negotiate. Only your physics answers it." Sigrid closed the ledger. She listened to the wind push against the wool walls and felt the walls push back, steady and warm and silent. The walls did not shudder. They did not flex. They held. The first snow fell on the 18th of October, light and dry, melting by midday. The second came on the 24th and stayed. By the first week of November, the temperature was dropping below 20 degrees at night, and Sigrid moved all her animals into the wool barn for the winter. The 40 sheep, the 2 milk cows, Corbin the mule, and a small flock of chickens in a separate enclosure within the structure. They settled into their assigned areas with the calm of animals who recognized that they had been brought to a good place. Leland came back from Hartwell's ranch on a gray afternoon in early November, his coat inadequate, and his face raw from the wind, and said without looking at her, "I will stay through the winter. Not because I believe you are right, because I have nowhere else to go." Sigrid nodded. "The spare bed is in the loft," she said. "Ladder on the left. No embrace. No warmth beyond what the words required. Leland climbed the ladder and lay down on the straw mattress she had prepared weeks ago, knowing he would eventually come, and he fell asleep without saying goodnight. Sigrid lay awake for a long time, listening to the boy's breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep, layered beneath it the slow breathing of 40 sheep and 2 cows and a mule in the space below. She opened her ledger one last time. "He is here now," she wrote. "All I need is time." She closed the book and blew out the lamp. Outside, the temperature was falling. The first real test of the wool walls was 3 days away. And what was coming for the Powder River country that winter was not a test at all. It was a reckoning, and it would not negotiate with anyone. The sound that woke Sigrid on the night of November 12th was not wind, it was silence. A silence so complete and so heavy that it pressed against the wool walls like something that had weight and intention, and she lay in the loft for several seconds with her eyes open in the dark, trying to understand what had changed. Then she realized that the wind, which had been a constant presence for 3 weeks every night since the first hard snow had stopped entirely. The air outside was perfectly still, and in that stillness, the cold had descended without anything to slow it, dropping straight down from the north, with the finality of a door being closed on everything warm. She dressed quickly and climbed down the ladder with her lantern. The animals below were quiet in the way that told her everything she needed to know before she even reached the thermometer. Not the restless quiet of creatures sensing danger, but the deep settled quiet of warmth and safety. The sheep lay in their straw with their legs folded beneath them. The 2 cows stood side by side near the hay rack, chewing with the mechanical patience of animals who had no reason to hurry. Corbin the mule was asleep, standing up, one ear forward and one ear back. Sigrid walked to the barn door, stepped into the vestibule, and opened the outer door. The cold hit her face like a fist made of something harder than ice. She raised the lantern to the thermometer she had mounted on the outer door frame and read the mercury. 17 degrees below zero. She stepped back inside, closed both doors carefully, and walked to the interior thermometer mounted on the opposite wall, 34 degrees above zero. 51 degrees of difference. No fire, no stove, no fuel of any kind. Just the body heat of 40 sheep and 2 cows and 1 mule held inside 8 inches of raw wool by the physics her grandmother had understood, and the construction Sigrid had spent 7 months completing. She stood in the center of the stable and laughed. It came out of her before she could stop it. A real laugh, the kind that has nothing to do with happiness exactly, but everything to do with vindication. And it echoed off the wool-packed walls, and the sheep lifted their heads briefly and then lowered them again, unconcerned. Above her, the loft boards creaked. Leland's face appeared at the edge, lit from below by the lantern, squinting down at her with the irritated expression of a boy pulled from sleep. "What are you laughing at?" Sigrid pointed at the 2 thermometers. 51 degrees, she said. No fire. Leland stared at the numbers. He looked at the sheep, breathing peacefully in their straw. He looked at the frost forming on the outside of the doorframe and at the complete absence of frost on the inside. He did not say anything sarcastic. He did not say anything at all. He simply looked, and then he pulled his head back into the loft and lay down again. Sigrid stood alone among her animals for another minute, holding the lantern. Then she opened her ledger and wrote the numbers. Outside 17 below, inside 34 above. Differential 51 degrees. She added 2 words beneath them and underlined both once. "It works." 3 miles north, Silas Hartwell's cattle stood on the open prairie under the same sky. The days that followed settled into a rhythm defined entirely by the animals and the cold. Sigrid woke before dawn, descended the ladder, and began the circuit that would occupy her until dark. She forked hay into the feeding racks. She broke the thin skin of ice that formed overnight on the water trough. She mucked the stalls and checked each sheep for signs of trouble. And every morning, the first thing she did after descending the ladder was look up at the ridge vent along the peak of the roof, watching for the faint draw of air that told her moisture was moving upward and out rather than condensing on the interior surfaces. This was the thing she checked the way a sailor checks his compass, not because she expected it to fail, but because it could not be allowed to fail without immediate correction. What surprised her was Leland. The boy who had refused to touch the wooden paddle in August began, in the second week of November, to help with the daily temperature readings. She had not asked him to. She had not suggested it. She had simply left the ledger open on a hay bale near the ladder each evening, And one morning she came down and found the dawn entry already recorded in his handwriting, careful and precise, the handwriting of a boy educated at a church school in Minnesota. He did not explain himself. She did not ask. The snow had made travel to Hartwell's ranch first difficult and then impossible. By the third week of November, the trail between the two properties had been buried under successive falls until the fence posts that served as markers were no longer visible, and without those posts, a rider could wander into open country and freeze before finding the way back. Leland stopped trying to leave. He was trapped, and he knew it. For the first 3 days of his confinement, he sat in the loft and stared at the ceiling with the particular misery of a young person who believes he has been imprisoned by circumstances rather than by weather. But by the fourth day, the ledger was there, the thermometers were there, and the act of recording numbers required no conversation with the woman. He was not yet ready to forgive for being alive when his father was not. He took over the dawn and midnight readings entirely by the end of November, carrying the lantern down the ladder 4 times a day, recording the numbers in Sigrid's ledger without speaking to her during these readings. But she noticed that he had begun to linger at the bottom of the ladder after the midnight entries, standing in the warm darkness among the sleeping animals for 2 or 3 minutes before climbing back up. She never spoke to him during these moments. She lay still, and she wondered whether the boy was beginning to understand that the warmth surrounding him was not an accident, but a decision, and that the decision had been made by someone whose judgment he had refused to trust. Then the wall failed. It happened in the first week of December, and Sigrid discovered it not through any dramatic sign, but through a number in the ledger. She was reviewing the previous week's readings when she noticed that the interior temperature at the northwest corner of the barn had been running consistently 4 degrees lower than the readings taken at the center of the building. 4 degrees was not catastrophic, but it was a pattern, and patterns did not lie. She took the lantern to the northwest corner that evening and held her palm flat against the interior sheathing. The wood felt different, not dramatically colder, but less alive, less responsive in the particular way that a well-insulated surface has a faint warmth even in midwinter. This surface felt neutral, indifferent. She understood immediately what had happened. In that corner where the snow drifted deepest against the outer wall, months of accumulated weight had compressed the wool beyond the density her grandmother had taught her to recognize. The fibers were still there, but the air had been pressed out of them. And without the air, the wool was only wool, not insulation. She got the pry bar and the wooden paddle from the tack room. She set the lantern on a hay bale where it would throw light on the wall, and she began pulling the interior sheathing boards off the northwest corner, working quietly so as not to disturb the animals, extracting each nail with the careful patience of someone who knows that the work cannot be rushed because there is no one to rush it. The loft boards creaked above her. Leland's bare feet appeared on the ladder, and then the rest of him pulling a coat around his shoulders against the air that was noticeably cooler in this corner than in the rest of the barn. What happened? The wool compressed, Sigrid said. The snow weight on the outer wall pushed it past the threshold. I have to pull it out and repack it tonight before the temperature drops any further. She said it plainly without drama, the way she said everything practical. She expected him to go back up the ladder. Instead, he stood at the bottom of it and watched her for a moment. Tell me what to hold, he said. She handed him the lantern without comment. He held it where she needed it, adjusting the angle when she moved without being asked for 3 hours while she excavated the compressed wool from the corner, worked it loose with her fingers until the fibers separated and remembered their shape, and repacked it section by section, with the paddle testing each handful by feel the way the old woman had shown her 40 years away and a lifetime ago. When the last board was nailed back in place, Leland set the lantern down on the hay bale and flexed his fingers, which had gone stiff from holding still in the cool corner air. The temperature in the corner was already recovering. He did not say anything about what they had just done together. He climbed back up the ladder and went to sleep. But the next morning, after recording the dawn temperature, he walked to each of the 4 corners of the barn and pressed his palm against the interior sheathing, spending a long moment at each one before moving to the next. She saw him do it. She said nothing. He had not been taught this. He had watched it done once, understood why it mattered, and decided on his own that it was part of the work now. Sigrid wrote nothing about it in the ledger. Some things did not require notation because they were already recorded in a different kind of book. The temperature dropped steadily through December, and with it, the world outside the barn began to come apart at the seams. Silas Hartwell arrived at the Crooked Creek Mercantile in mid-December with a face that had aged 5 years since September. He reported to the men gathered around the stove that he had already lost 75 head, mostly calves and older cows, that lacked the body reserves to survive the persistent cold. The cattle were not freezing outright. They were starving. A hard frost had sealed the prairie grass under a crust of ice that the animals could not break through, and Hartwell had not stored nearly enough hay to feed 400 head through what was clearly going to be an unusually long and ruthless winter. Sigrid heard this at the mercantile the following Saturday. She listened, made her purchases, and drove home without comment. There was a day in late December when she and Leland made the same trip together. The runners of the wagon hissing through the packed snow, Corbin leaning into the traces with the patience of an animal that has made its peace with winter. The mercantile was crowded. A dozen ranchers and their hands stood around the iron stove exchanging casualty reports in the flat, matter-of-fact tone that men use when they are describing losses they cannot afford and do not want to feel. Hartwell saw Leland across the room. He raised his voice above the general conversation. "Boy," he said, "those sheep your stepmother keeps in that wool box of hers, they still alive or did they suffocate in all that fleece?" A few men laughed. The sound was thin, the laughter of men who needed something to laugh at and had not found much to choose from lately. Leland was standing near the dry goods counter with his hands in his pockets. 3 months ago, he would have reddened and looked at the floor and mumbled something agreeable. 3 months ago, he would have been grateful to Hartwell for giving him a way out of the embarrassment of association with this woman and her wool barn. But 3 months ago, he had not spent 60 consecutive nights recording temperatures in a building that held steady while the world outside fell apart. He had not repacked a failing wall section in the middle of the night and felt the barn recover before morning. He had not watched the ledger fill up with numbers that told the same story in every entry, while the stories coming out of the mercantile every Saturday told a very different one. "Her animals are not dying," Leland said. His voice was quiet. It was not raised for effect or performance, but it carried through the room the way quiet voices carry when the room has gone still enough to hear them. "Yours are." The laughter stopped. The room went silent in the particular way that rooms go silent when someone has said a true thing that every person present already knew and no one had been willing to say aloud. Several men looked at Leland with the startled attention that people give to a boy who has just done something an adult in the room should have done first. Hartwell's face darkened. His jaw worked. He opened his mouth and then closed it because there was nothing to say. The numbers were the numbers. His animals were dying and Sigrid's were not, and both of these facts were known to everyone standing in that room. Sigrid was near the canned goods at the back of the store. She had heard every word. Her hands were not entirely steady. Leland walked out without looking at anyone. She followed him a few minutes later and found him sitting in the wagon with his collar turned up, his eyes on the horizon to the north, where a low gray mass of cloud was building above the ridgeline. She climbed up beside him and took the reins. They drove home in silence for the first mile, the cold air moving past them and the snow making its sound beneath the runners. "I didn't say it for you," Leland said. He was still watching the horizon. Sigrid kept her eyes on the trail ahead. "I know that. I said it because it was true. Their animals are dying and yours are not. That is a fact, not loyalty, arithmetic." "I know that too," Sigrid said. He was quiet for another quarter mile. The cloud mass to the north had grown while they were driving, spreading south along the ridge, in a way that had nothing casual about it. "But if it hadn't been true," Leland said, still facing the horizon, "I wouldn't have said it." Sigrid understood what he was telling her. He was not declaring himself her ally or surrendering the resentment he carried for reasons that had nothing to do with wool or barns or winter. He was simply acknowledging that the evidence had become too heavy to carry in the other direction, and that a boy raised to be honest could not stand in a room full of men and allow a lie to go unchallenged when the truth was sleeping warm and alive 3 miles away in a barn that every person in that room had mocked. She did not thank him. He did not explain further. But she noticed when they arrived home and he unhitched Corbin and led the mule to the barn that he checked the northwest corner before he climbed back up to the loft. Hosea Coldwater came in the 3rd week of November with a wagon load of hay that Sigrid had purchased from him in October, and he spent an hour inside the barn after unloading it, moving slowly from section to section, with the thoroughness of a man who builds things himself and understands what he is looking at. He tested the ventilation by holding a strip of cloth near the ridge vent and watching the gentle draw of air upward. He examined the door gaskets. He pressed his boot against the floor and felt the solidity of the assembly beneath the straw. When he came back outside and stood in the cold, he said, "Mrs. Montrose, your sheep are warmer in there than I am in my own house." Then his expression changed. He lowered his voice. "I need to tell you something. Ashby has already spoken to 2 council members in Cheyenne. I heard it from the freighter who runs the eastern route. He is not waiting for the winter to end. He is collecting signatures, now calling your walls a fire hazard, and he has found men willing to put their names on the paper before the losses come in. He believes the winter will be mild enough to save him." Sigrid felt the ground move beneath her. She had prepared for mockery. She had endured Hartwell's lectures and Reverend Abner's theology, and the newspaper article, and Leland's contempt. But she had not prepared for this particular shape of danger. Ashby was not a man with an opinion. He was a man with votes. "Could you speak for me?" she asked before the council. "You understand the principles better than most." Coldwater shook his head slowly. "My words carry no weight before a council of white men," he said. "You know that, Mrs. Montrose." They stood together in the cold sunshine, and neither of them spoke for a while. They both lived in a territory where the people who understood things best were the people least likely to be heard. The irony of this was not lost on either of them, but irony does not keep you warm, and it does not change a vote. That evening, Sigrid wrote in her ledger, "If the winter is mild, Ashby will destroy me through paperwork. If the winter is severe, Ashby will lose his cattle. I do not want either of those things, but I do not get to choose." January arrived without mercy. On the morning of the 8th, an Arctic air mass settled over the northern plains with the finality of a geological event. The temperature at Crooked Creek dropped to 44 below zero by sunrise on the 9th, and it did not recover. Day after day, the thermometers across the territory recorded readings between 30 and 52 below, with the lowest temperatures occurring on the still windless nights when the sky was clear and the stars burned with a brightness that seemed to come from the cold itself. Sigrid descended from the loft on the morning of January 11th and made her readings. Outside, 48 below zero. Inside, 26 above. 74 degrees of difference. She stared at the numbers for a long time. She wrote them in the ledger and underlined the differential 3 times. Beneath it, she wrote a single word: "Grandmother." That was all. The water trough showed no ice. The animals ate their hay and lay in their straw and breathed the still warm air as if winter were something happening to other creatures in another country. 4 miles to the north, Ashby's cattle were dying in numbers that would not be fully understood until spring. In the 3rd week of January, with the temperature still hovering near 40 below, one of the ewes went into labor. Sigrid had been watching her for 2 days. The animal was restless, separating herself from the flock the way ewes do when their time is close. Leland noticed it on the morning of the 21st and asked what was happening. Sigrid told him. He looked at the ewe and then at the barn door, beyond which the thermometer read 41 below zero. If she were outside, he said, it was not a question. The lambs would be dead within the hour, Sigrid said. Newborns cannot regulate their own body temperature for the first several days. Below 20 degrees, they freeze regardless of how close the mother holds them. The ewe delivered twin lambs late that afternoon in the warm straw of the lambing pen, with Sigrid's hands guiding the second one when it came wrong. Leland stood behind her, holding the lantern, his face pale but his hands steady watching. The first lamb stood within 30 minutes. The second took nearly an hour, wobbling on legs that seemed too long for its body, but it found the teat and began to nurse, and both lambs were breathing and warm and alive when the light outside the barn windows had faded entirely to black. Leland set the lantern down. He sat on an overturned bucket and watched the lambs pressed against their mother's flank. Outside the barn, the temperature was 41 below zero. Inside, it was 30 degrees above. The lambs' small sides rose and fell with the rhythm of creatures who had entered the world in a place warm enough to receive them. Your grandmother, Leland said quietly. She was right. She was always right, Sigrid said. She did not say more than that, and he did not ask for more. A boy who had spent 5 months refusing to acknowledge what was directly in front of him had finally seen it, not through argument, not through explanation, through the simple act of watching 2 lives begin in a space that should not have been warm enough to sustain them, but was. Meanwhile, in the office of the Cheyenne Tribune, a different kind of confrontation was taking shape. Willa Utterback placed a 12-page manuscript on her editor's desk in late January and stood with her hands clasped in front of her, which was what she did when she needed to appear more composed than she felt. The editor read the first 3 pages without expression. Then he set the manuscript down. "I won't run this," he said. "Why not?" "Because it tells my readers they were fools." "People do not want to read that." "1.5 million cattle are dead," Willa said. She kept her voice level. "They already know they were fools. What they do not know is what to do differently. This article tells them." The editor leaned back in his chair. "It also makes this paper look bad. We ran the first story." "We did. And the first story was wrong. The correction should come from us, not from some agricultural bulletin in Nebraska." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "If I run this, the cattle associations will cancel their advertising. Half our revenue comes from those accounts." Willa had anticipated this. "If you do not run this," she said, "every rancher who rebuilds next spring will remember that the Tribune laughed at the woman who could have saved their breeding stock, and they will cancel anyway. The only question is whether they remember us as the paper that got it wrong or the paper that was honest enough to say so." The editor picked up the manuscript again. He read 2 more pages. Then he set it down a second time and looked at her over his reading glasses with the expression of a man deciding whether he is being outmaneuvered or simply persuaded. "I will give you until spring," he said. "If the losses are what you say they will be, bring me the numbers and I will reconsider." Willa took the manuscript back and left without pushing further. She had worked for this man for 4 years, and she knew that until spring and February's context meant something closer to yes than no. She also knew that the losses were already beyond anything the numbers would adequately describe. The second stage of the disaster began on the 25th of January, when snow started falling and did not stop for 16 days. It came in heavy, wet flakes on the first day, then in dry powder driven by winds that gusted past 60 miles an hour, then in fine granular crystals that filled every depression and buried every fence post and transformed the prairie into an unbroken white surface as hard and featureless as a tabletop. Drifts reached 15 feet against any vertical obstruction. Cattle that had been weakened by 3 weeks of extreme cold now found themselves unable to reach any food at all. Hay supplies that had been carefully rationed through December were exhausted. There was no neighbor close enough to borrow from no railroad, road that could ship feed fast enough to matter, no government program to provide relief. The cattle began to die in numbers that would not be fully comprehended until the snow finally retreated. Silas Hartwell rode up to Sigrid's gate on the 8th of February. His horse picked its way through drifts that came to its chest, and the man himself looked as if he had not slept in 2 weeks. His cheeks were hollow, his eyes were red-rimmed and raw from wind. He sat on his exhausted horse at the gate and called out, and when Sigrid came out of the barn, he began to speak in a voice that broke twice before he finished. "Mrs. Montrose, I have lost more than half my herd. The ones that are left, maybe 60 head, are at my line shack, and they are dying because the wind comes straight through the cottonwood walls. I have heard that your animals are alive, that your barn keeps them warm." He stopped. He swallowed. He looked at the snow and then at her face and then at the snow again. "I have come to ask if I could bring some of my breeding cows here, just the best ones. Just the ones I need to start again in the spring. I will pay whatever you ask, but I cannot watch them die. Mrs. Montrose, I cannot watch any more of them die." Sigrid looked at this man. She looked at him carefully and completely, the way she had looked at the wool walls in the early mornings of last summer, when she was trying to see whether what she had built was true or only wishful. She saw a man who had been broken and was trying to reassemble himself into something better than what he had been. She recognized the effort. She had done it herself in the months after Anders died. She felt no satisfaction in any of this. She had searched for that feeling more than once in the past several weeks, and she had never found it. What she found instead was a deep and unfamiliar sadness for the animals that had died because their owner had been too certain of his own knowledge to consider that someone else might know something he did not. Behind her, Leland appeared in the barn door. He looked at Hartwell. He saw the man who had given him a cowboy hat and taught him to count cattle and told him stories about the open range that made it sound like the only honest way a man could live. He saw that man sitting on a spent horse in the snow asking for the thing he had spent 6 months calling worthless. She will take your cattle, Leland said. I will clear the hay storage at the south end tonight. Sigrid looked at him. She nodded once. Bring them tomorrow, she said to Hartwell. As many as you can move through the snow. I will have a place ready. 23 cows arrived the next afternoon. Hartwell and 3 of his remaining hands had worked through the night to break a trail through the drifts. 2 animals died on the way and were left where they fell. The surviving 21 were moved into the south end of the barn, into the space Leland had spent the night clearing, and when the doors closed behind them and the wool gaskets sealed against the frames, the cattle stood for a long time in the unfamiliar warmth, breathing slowly, swaying on legs that had carried them 4 miles through chest-deep snow. Within an hour, 2 had lain down. Within 3 hours, all 21 were either resting or eating from the hay racks. In the days that followed, the barn filled further. Cornelius Holloway came on the 11th with his family's milk cow and his daughter's pony, both animals thin and trembling, and Sigrid took them in without hesitation. On the 13th, Bertrand Beaumont appeared at the gate, a Basque sheep herder of about 55 whose flock of 200 had been reduced to 35 survivors. He had carried 3 of the weakest animals on his shoulders over the last mile of the journey, one at a time, the way his father had carried injured lambs in the mountains above his childhood home. When Leland saw him coming through the snow from the window, he ran out and opened the gate and helped carry the last ewe inside without being asked and without saying a word about it. Beaumont asked permission to sleep in the tack room. Sigrid agreed. He proved to be a skilled and calm presence with the lambing that was now occurring regularly, and he began singing quietly to the ewes during difficult deliveries. Low, wordless sounds that seemed to ease something in the animals, even when nothing else could. On the 14th of February, Reverend Abner rode up to the gate. Sigrid felt something tighten in her chest when she saw him. She thought of the word he had used in August, and the expression on his face when she had answered him, and the way his departure had preceded 2 weeks of whispering in Crooked Creek. She stepped outside to meet him. But Reverend Abner had not come about livestock. He had not come about wool or walls or the theology of insulation. Behind him, walking in single file through the broken trail, were 2 families from Crooked Creek, a carpenter named Briggs and a blacksmith named Hadley, both of whom had lost every animal they owned and were now running out of firewood in their cabins. The Briggs children were bundled in every piece of clothing their parents could find. The Hadley boys, 8 and 10 years old, had their faces wrapped in scarves until only their eyes showed. Reverend Abner dismounted. He stood at the gate with his hat in his hands, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the assured authority it had held in August. Mrs. Montrose, he said, I know that I have no right to ask you anything. I said things to you last summer that I should not have said, but these 2 families are in danger of freezing in their own homes. Your barn is warmer than any structure within 50 miles, and I am asking you to shelter these people until the weather breaks. Sigrid looked at the children. Bring them in, she said. Reverend Abner's shoulders dropped. It was not quite a bow, but it occupied the same territory. I will not forget this, he said. I will not forget either, Reverend Sigrid said, but not for the reason you think. By the following morning, Radford Ashby was at the gate. The scene was the one that had opened this story, the 8 bulls, the 4 minutes of silence. The man who had wielded the word coffin like a verdict, finding himself standing at the threshold of the thing he had condemned, unable to speak. Leland was shoveling the path between the barn and the well when Ashby came through the gate, leading the bulls behind him. Ashby slowed as he passed the boy. Your stepmother? He started to say. She told you in the September, Leland said. You called it a coffin. Ashby nodded once slowly without meeting the boy's eyes. Then he led his bulls into the barn and did not turn around. By the 3rd week of February, Sigrid Montrose was sheltering her own 40 sheep. Her 2 milk cows, Corbin the chickens, 21 of Hartwell's breeding cows, the Holloway family's milk cow and pony, 35 of Beaumont's surviving sheep, 8 of Ashby's breeding bulls, 2 displaced families, and a Basque sheep herder who sang to the ewes in the dark. Nearly 120 living things. The temperature inside held at 45 degrees during the day and 40 at night. Not a single animal that crossed Sigrid's threshold died inside her walls. Outside across the Powder River country, and beyond it across the high plains from southern Montana to eastern Nebraska, the losses were reaching a scale that no one had a framework to comprehend. The open-range cattle industry that had defined the Western economy for 15 years was in the process of collapsing in a single season, though no one had named this yet. The numbers were still being made by the cold, and the cold was not finished. Late one night, after the families had settled onto pallets in the loft, and Beaumont had finished his rounds with the ewes and Leland had fallen asleep with the ledger open on his chest, Sigrid stood alone in the center of the stable. She looked at the sleeping animals and the sleeping people and the wool walls that held them all in warmth while the territory outside was being remade by catastrophe. She opened her ledger to a fresh page. "Grandmother," she wrote, "you said the cold does not negotiate. You were right. But you forgot to tell me that a barn can hold more than animals. You forgot to tell me that warmth once made does not distinguish between the creatures it keeps alive." She stopped writing. She listened. Above her, the wind pressed against the roof with everything it had, and the wool pressed back steady and silent and completely sure of itself. Inside that margin of held air, 120 lives continued breathing through the worst winter the American West had ever seen. In the morning, everything would begin to change. The Chinook was coming, and with it would come the reckoning, the numbers and the silence of a man who had 4,000 cattle and had called this place a coffin. The Chinook came on the 17th of February like a pardon no one had thought to request. It arrived before dawn as a low sustained rush from the direction of the Bighorn Mountains that was different from the wind Sigrid had known all winter. That wind had been a weapon. This was something else entirely. It moved across the frozen prairie with a warmth that had no right to exist in February, and by the time the sky began to lighten in the east, the thermometer outside the barn had risen 30 degrees in 6 hours. The snow did not melt, not in any meaningful sense, but it settled and compacted under its own weight, and by mid-morning the surface had crusted over hard enough to support a horse. The sky, which had been a low gray ceiling for 6 weeks, broke open into pale blue from the west and moved steadily east. And for the first time since the first week of January, the sun appeared above the horizon with enough strength to cast actual shadows on the snow. Sigrid stood outside the barn that morning and turned her face toward it. The air was still cold, still well below freezing, but it had lost the quality that had defined every breath for the past 6 weeks. That quality was hard to describe to someone who had not experienced it. It was not simply temperature, it was intention. The killing cold had a presence to it, a weight that pushed against exposed skin, not merely to make it uncomfortable, but to end it. That presence was gone. What remained was ordinary winter, the kind that required a coat and a hat and sensible boots, but did not require a person to weigh every minute outdoors against the possibility of not returning. Inside the barn, the animals felt the change before Sigrid opened the door to them. The sheep had moved to the south wall where the morning sun would eventually reach the outer sheathing. The cows had their heads up and turned toward the door. Even Corbin, who had spent the winter in a state of philosophical acceptance that nothing could disturb, was awake and alert, his ears tracking the new sound of the Chinook moving across the roof above him. Bertrand Beaumont came out of the tack room, rubbing his eyes, and stood beside Sigrid in the morning light. He looked at the sky for a long time. Then he crossed himself and said something in Basque that Sigrid did not understand, but that had the cadence and the gravity of a prayer of genuine relief, the kind that comes not from habit, but from having had reason to doubt that relief was possible. The two families left that same day. The carpenter Briggs shook Sigrid's hand at the gate with both of his own hands wrapped around hers, holding on for a moment longer than a handshake requires, as if he were trying to communicate something that the gesture would have to carry because words were insufficient. His wife gathered their 3 children and walked south along the crusted snow toward Crooked Creek, the children's breath making small clouds that the Chinook immediately dissolved. The blacksmith Hadley could not speak it at all. He simply touched the brim of his hat, looked at Sigrid for a moment, and then walked away with his wife and his 2 boys without turning back. She watched them until they were small figures against the white landscape, and then smaller still, and then gone. She stood at the gate for a while after they had disappeared. She thought about the 2 weeks those families had spent inside her barn, sleeping on hay bale pallets in the loft, eating from what she had, warming themselves at the body heat of animals they did not own. And she thought about the fact that not once in all that time had either of them asked her a single question about how the walls had been built. The work of understanding what the winter had done began in the days that followed, and the numbers when they came were beyond what anyone had imagined, even in the worst of their private calculations. Silas Hartwell lost 87% of his herd. Of the 400 cattle he had ranged in October, fewer than 52 were alive in March. The Powder River land, and Cattle Company, the second largest operation in the basin, lost 95% of its stock. Across the territory from southern Montana to eastern Nebraska, total cattle losses ran between 60 and 90% depending on location. The best estimates, which would take months to compile and years to fully believe, put the number of cattle killed by the winter of 1886 to 1887 at well over 1.5 million animals. Banks that had lent money against cattle that no longer existed failed in succession across 3 territories. Eastern investors who had funded the great ranching enterprises pulled their capital out of the West and refused to return. The open-range cattle industry, which had defined the Western economy for 15 years and had seemed as permanent as the land itself, collapsed in a single season. Ranchers who had been wealthy in October were bankrupt by March. And the lesson that emerged from this, slowly at first, and then with the clarity of something that should have been obvious all along, was that the assumption underlying the entire system had been catastrophically wrong. The cattle had not been tough enough to survive without shelter. They had only been fortunate enough not to need it yet. The luck had run out in January of 1887 and would never come back in the same form. Sigrid returned everyone's animals in the first week of March. She did it without ceremony, one group at a time, with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that the most important thing she could do now was allow people to begin rebuilding without making them feel diminished in the process. Silas Hartwell came first. He arrived on a Tuesday morning with 3 of his surviving hands in a string of lead ropes, and he stood at the gate in the precise spot where he had sat his horse the previous July and explained to Sigrid that wool was money, that mice would nest in her walls by Christmas, that tough animals needed range and the Lord's mercy and nothing else. He stood there now without his horse on foot in the snow, and he watched his 21 breeding cows file through the gate on legs that had grown noticeably stronger in 3 weeks of regular feeding and heated shelter. When the last cow had passed, he took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Mrs. Montrose," he said, "I owe you more than money. I owe you an apology in front of anyone willing to listen. You were right and I was wrong. And my being wrong killed more than 300 cattle that would still be alive if I had listened to you last summer." Sigrid looked at him for a moment before she answered. "You were not wrong because you did not know, Mr. Hartwell," she said. "You were wrong because you did not ask." Hartwell put his hat back on. He nodded once, and there was something in the nod that was neither agreement nor disagreement, but something more complicated than either the acknowledgement of a man who has been told a precise truth about himself and is deciding to carry it rather than argue with it. He gathered his cows and drove them north toward what remained of his ranch. He would rebuild on a smaller scale, never more than 200 head, and he would insulate every structure on his property with wool batting for the rest of his working life. He lived until 1908, and he was known in the Powder River country in his later years for a habit of referring to Sigrid Montrose as the woman who taught me what I should have known. He said it without irony and without self-pity, the way a man states a fact that has become part of how he understands the world. Bertrand Beaumont left the same morning. His 35 surviving sheep were gathered in the yard, standing in the March sunlight, with the slightly dazed quality of animals who have been through something and are not sure what to make of the fact that they are still alive. Beaumont stood beside them with his bedroll over his shoulder and his rifle in his hand, and he looked at Sigrid with an expression that held gratitude and grief in a proportion that words, even in a shared language, would have struggled to sort out. He had lost 165 animals. The sheep that remained were the ones he had carried to her gate through waist-deep snow on the 13th of February, 3 of them draped across his shoulders one at a time when they could not walk. He had almost not come. He had turned back twice, once at the first drift that reached his chest, and once when the third ewe collapsed, and he stood in the snow trying to calculate whether he had the strength left to carry her, and decided he did not, and then carried her anyway. He reached into his coat and brought out a pair of shearing scissors. The handles were worn smooth from decades of use. The blades were Toledo steel, his father's before they were his, and they still held an edge that could separate fleece from skin in a single clean pass. He held them out to Sigrid. "You saved my flock," he said. "This is the most valuable thing I own." Sigrid took the scissors. They were heavy and warm from being kept against his body, and she held them in both hands and understood that she had just been given something that had nothing to do with cutting wool. These were the continuation of a man's livelihood, passed across generations, offered to a woman he had known for less than a month, because that woman had done what no one else in the territory had been willing to do. Beaumont embraced her briefly, the embrace of a man who does not often embrace people, and means it more completely because of that. Then he gathered his sheep and walked south along the creek toward his own claim. Sigrid stood at the gate, holding the Toledo scissors, and watched him until the sheep disappeared around the bend in the creek. She thought of his father carrying injured lambs in the mountains, above a country she would never see. She thought of the unbroken line of that kind of stubbornness, the refusal to leave the living behind, moving forward through whatever the terrain required. She kept those scissors for the rest of her life. They hung on a nail beside the barn door, and she used them every shearing season without fail. And every time she picked them up, she thought of the man who had carried 3 dying animals on his shoulders rather than let the snow have them. Radford Ashby collected his 8 bulls in the early morning of the following week. He came without announcement and without his foreman alone with a lead rope, and he moved through the work of loading the bulls with the efficiency of a man who wants to complete a task and leave before the completion of it requires him to say something he does not know how to say. He did not apologize. Sigrid had known he would not. The pride that had built a 4,000-head empire was the same pride that made certain words unavailable to him. And Sigrid understood this the way she understood the ridge vent above her head as a structural feature with a specific function that could not be altered without changing the nature of the thing entirely. She did not require an apology from him. She had stopped requiring things from people that they were constitutionally unable to provide. But when the last bull had passed through the gate, and Ashby stood with his back to her and his face toward the open range where his cattle had died by the thousands, he stopped. He did not turn around. He stood very still for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was low and entirely without performance. "I called this place a coffin," he said. "It was the only thing left alive." Then he walked on, leading his bulls north, and those were the last words he ever spoke to Sigrid Montrose. She learned the rest of his story in pieces over the years that followed the way news travels in a place where people are spread thin across a large landscape. He never recovered financially from the disaster. He sold his rangeland to pay his creditors and spent his remaining years working as a clerk in the Cheyenne stockyards, the very yards through which he had once been one of the largest consignors in the territory. He died in 1894 in a hotel room in Cheyenne alone, at the age of 57. The last thing he was known to have said to anyone was spoken to a fellow clerk at the shipping desk on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon without apparent context or explanation. "I had 4,000 cattle and not one wall," Ashby said. "Now I have walls all around me and not one cow." The man who heard this did not understand what it meant. But Silas Hartwell would have understood, and Hosea Coldwater would have understood. And Sigrid would have understood because all of them had lived through the same winter and come out the other side, knowing that the line between prosperity and ruin had been exactly 8 inches of raw wool, and that the people who had put it there were the people the world had spent the previous summer laughing at. Cornelius Holloway came for his milk cow and his daughter's pony on a bright afternoon, and he paid for their 3 weeks of shelter with a generous side of beef from one of the few cattle his family had managed to save. His daughter Greer, 9 years old, led the pony out of the barn herself and then turned around and ran back inside and wrapped her arms around Sigrid's waist and stood there without saying anything. Sigrid had sewn a small wool blanket for the child during the long February nights, working by lamplight after the others were asleep, cutting and stitching from remnants of the felt she had made from her own fleece. She draped it around Greer's shoulders now, and the girl pulled it tight around herself and walked away beside her father and her pony, and Sigrid watched her go until the 3 of them reached the road and turned east toward home. She stood at the gate until the road was empty. Then she went back inside to check the ewes. Reverend Abner came on a Sunday morning in late March to return the blankets Sigrid had lent to the 2 families. He stood at the gate with a folded stack of wool blankets in his arms, and he looked like a man who has been rehearsing something and is not certain whether the rehearsal was adequate preparation for the actual performance. Sigrid took the blankets. "Mrs. Montrose," Reverend Abner said, "I intend to preach about this on Easter Sunday, about what I said to you last summer, about what the winter demonstrated. I thought you should know that before it happens, in case it changes anything for you." Sigrid considered him. He was not asking for her approval. He was giving her information, which was a more respectful thing than asking for approval, because it assumed she was capable of doing something with the information rather than simply being moved by the gesture of disclosure. "It does not change anything for me," she said. "But say what is true, Reverend. That is always worth saying." He nodded. He left. On Easter Sunday, Reverend Abner stood at the pulpit of the small frame church in Crooked Creek and spoke for nearly 40 minutes. The core of what he said was this: the previous summer, he had told a woman that protecting her livestock with wool insulation was an expression of insufficient faith in God's design for his creatures. The winter had demonstrated with a finality that left no room for theological evasion that God had provided wool precisely so that it could be used in exactly the way that woman had used it. The arrogance, he said, was not in protecting animals from cold. The arrogance was in believing that he understood the mind of God when what he actually understood was only his own habits and assumptions and the comfortable theology he had built around them. He paused after saying this, and the silence in the church was the kind that congregations produce only when a minister has said something they were not prepared to hear. A rancher in the third pew crossed his arms. The woman beside him wiped her eyes with a handkerchief. In the back row, one of Ashby's former foremen stood up and walked out without closing the door behind him, and the April wind moved through the opening and stirred the pages of the hymnals on the pew racks like something making a point. Reverend Abner continued. He said that the winter had taught him the difference between faith and assumption. Faith was trusting that God had provided the materials and the knowledge to survive. Assumption was believing that survival required no effort because God would manage the details. He had confused the two, and the confusion had cost animals their lives and families their futures, and he would carry that understanding as part of his ministry for the rest of his career. Josephine and Cornelius Holloway sat near the front. Josephine reached across and took Henry's hand. He looked at her and then at the pulpit and then at his own hands, and he was one of the men who nodded. Reverend Abner kept a small piece of raw fleece on his desk in the parsonage for the rest of his career. When visitors asked about it, he told them it was a reminder of a lesson learned at considerable cost. He never became a close friend of Sigrid's, but he was occasionally heard to tell people who were new to the territory that if they wanted to understand how to build a barn that would actually protect their animals through a Wyoming winter, they should ride out to the Weston place and ask the woman there to show them. He said it simply as information without drama, which made it more useful than if he had said it any other way. In the spring of 1887, a letter arrived from Minnesota. It was written in the trembling hand of Leland's grandfather, and its message was simple. The obligation to the stepmother had been fulfilled. The boy had endured enough. It was time for him to come home to people who shared his blood. Leland read the letter at the kitchen table in Sigrid's cabin. He read it twice, folded it precisely along its original creases, and placed it on the table between them. Sigrid read it once and set it down and waited. "I am going to write back," Leland said. "I am going to tell them I'm staying." Sigrid looked at him across the table. She saw the boy who had arrived the previous August with a trunk and a wall of silence around him, who had called her Mrs. Montrose with the formality of someone establishing terms, who had refused the wooden paddle and ridden away to Hartwell's ranch every morning as if distance was a solution. That boy was still visible in Leland's face. She could see him in the set of his jaw and the careful way he held himself, as if feeling too much about any of this would cost him something he could not afford to lose. But there was something else there now, accumulated across many months, the way temperature readings accumulate in a ledger until the pattern they describe is undeniable. "Why?" Sigrid asked. Leland was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands on the table, the hands that had held the lantern while twin lambs were born in January, the hands that had written temperature readings 4 times a day through 3 months of winter, the hands that had cleared the south end of the barn the night Hartwell came to the gate, working through the dark without being asked. "Because my father would have wanted me to learn from someone who knows how to keep things alive," he said. Sigrid did not cry. She had used what she had available for that on a September evening by the creek, listening to Leland speak in a voice that was not his father's, but carried his father's worst certainties. What she felt now was different. It was something settling into place the way snow settles and compacts, and becomes something you can stand on solid enough to bear weight. "There is a loft extension that needs building," she said. "We can start this afternoon." Leland nodded. Not Mrs. Montrose. Just a nod from a person who has made a decision and sees no reason to elaborate on it, because elaboration would diminish what the decision actually means. That afternoon, they measured the extension together. Leland held the tape. Sigrid marked the positions. The work ahead of them was considerable, and neither of them said anything about it that was not directly related to the work. That was enough. That was in fact everything. The method spread through the Powder River country in the years that followed, not as a novelty or a curiosity, but as the practical solution to a practical problem that the winter of 1886 to 1887 had made impossible to ignore. By the autumn of 1887, Silas Hartwell had commissioned a new wool-insulated barn on his rebuilt property, hiring 2 men and paying Sigrid to supervise the construction. She stood in his yard on a September morning and watched the double walls go up, and when the men began filling the cavity, she walked the line and checked each section the way she had checked her own, adjusting where adjustment was needed, moving on when the density was right. Hartwell watched her work without speaking. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been given a second chance and understands with considerable clarity exactly what it cost. Willa Utterback returned in April with a leather satchel containing the manuscript she had been working on since February. 12 pages. Technical in its description of the construction and precise in its accounting of the winter's outcome. It named names and cited numbers and quoted with full attribution Silas Hartwell's July observation about mice and Christmas and Radford Ashby's September assessment involving coffins and sheep. It concluded that the foundational assumption of the open-range cattle industry had been proven wrong by the worst winter in the memory of the American West, and that the correction had been provided by a Norwegian immigrant widow whose methods had been publicly ridiculed by every man who subsequently came to her gate asking for help. I need you to read it and correct any technical errors, Willa said. And I need to ask you something. Hosea Coldwater, his family's knowledge of this same principle, what happened to them in 1862? Should that be in the article? Sigrid read the manuscript standing in the yard. She corrected 2 details and handed it back. It should be in the article, she said. It was there first. The knowledge was there before any of us, and the people who carried it paid a price for having it ignored. That makes anything that happened to me look trivial. If you leave that out, the article is telling only half of a truth, and half of a truth is its own kind of distortion. Willa wrote it down. She went to see Coldwater that week, and what he told her went into the final manuscript in his own words, preserved with the care that his account deserved. The article encountered resistance at the Cheyenne Tribune. Willa's editor read the piece twice and said that it told his readers they had been fools and that people did not want to read that. Willa told him that 1.5 million cattle were dead, and her readers already knew they had been fools. What they needed to know was what to do differently, and the article told them. She also told him that the Tribune had run the first story, and that the choice before him was whether the paper would be remembered as the one that laughed at the woman who was right, or the one that was honest enough to say so when the evidence was beyond dispute. The piece ran in the summer of 1888. It was not read as widely as the original article because corrections never are. But it was the first time a major territorial newspaper had publicly acknowledged that the cattle industry's foundational assumption had been wrong, and that the corrective knowledge had come from a woman the paper itself had helped to ridicule. Leland stayed in Wyoming. He learned to build insulated barns and to read weather from the way grass moved in autumn wind, and to manage a sheep flock through seasons that the high plains made difficult in different ways each year. He grew into a tall, quiet man with his father's jaw and something in the steadiness of his hands that had no precedent in either of his parents and seemed to be entirely his own. In 1894, he married the daughter of a rancher from the Tongue River country and built his homestead 12 miles east of Sigrid's place. The barn he built for himself took 3 months of careful work, and when he finished, he brought Sigrid out to inspect it. She walked the perimeter slowly, her palm moving along the interior walls, pausing and moving on, pausing and moving on. At the end of the inspection, she turned to him and nodded. "Your grandmother would approve," she said. It was the highest thing she knew how to say. Leland understood that and what it meant that she had said it to him, and he carried it the way he carried everything that mattered to him, without display and without putting it down. In the years that followed, he became the most effective advocate for Sigrid's methods in the territory, not because he possessed technical knowledge that others lacked, but because he could tell the story in a way that reached men who were too proud to learn from a woman. "I am the one who laughed at her," he would say to ranchers who came to see the wool barn. "I lived in the same house and I thought she was wrong. Then I spent a winter inside those walls while 1.5 million cattle froze to death on the open range. And I watched lambs born in 40 below zero stand up and nurse in air warm enough to keep them alive. If I can change my mind, so can you. He said this dozens of times over the years, and the words never changed because they did not need to. The truth does not require variation. It only requires the willingness to keep saying it. Sigrid Montrose married again in 1892. Albrecht Zimmermann was a German blacksmith who had settled in Crooked Creek 2 years earlier, a quiet man with strong hands and no opinions about how other people should build their barns. He had come to Wyoming from Pennsylvania, where his father had worked in the iron foundries of Pittsburgh, and he carried with him the particular humility of a man who has seen industry up close and understands that the people who build things are rarely the people who receive credit for them. He saw Sigrid's barn and her flock and her reputation, and he did not try to improve any of them. He simply added himself to what was already there and let it be better for the addition. On their wedding day, he gave her a wool comb he had forged himself from good steel, balanced and precisely weighted the teeth set at the angle her grandmother's comb had used. Sigrid held it and felt the balance and the care in it and understood that this man had paid attention to what mattered to her and had made something accordingly. She kept the wool comb and the Toledo scissors side by side on the shelf above the barn door for the rest of her life. They raised 3 children together. The oldest, a boy they named Anders, showed a particular talent for construction and eventually built insulated barns as far away as Montana and the Dakotas. The middle child, a girl named Marin, after Sigrid's grandmother, became a school teacher in Crooked Creek and taught a generation of children the basic principles of insulation as part of her science lessons. The youngest was named Josias, after the man who had pressed his hand against a barn wall in September of 1886 and said, "This is built well," and whose daughter had learned to make the felt gaskets that sealed the doors of half the ranches in the basin. Hosea Coldwater died in 1903 on his own land, his wife and children around him. Sigrid attended the burial and stood at the edge of the small group of mourners and thought about the afternoon he had walked into her empty barn and said what no one else in the territory had been willing to say. She thought about the 200 horses his father had lost in 1862 and the knowledge that had survived that loss and traveled forward through Coldwater to that September afternoon, and through that afternoon into every barn that had been built correctly in the years since. The original wool barn served for 30 years. Sigrid replaced the outer sheathing twice and topped up the wall cavities with fresh fleece every 5 years, but the basic structure never required rebuilding. Visitors came from across the territory and eventually from across the region, agricultural agents and university professors and ranchers from states that were only beginning to grapple with the implications of that winter. All of them walked through the same barn door and stood in the same warmth and understood without needing. It explained a second time why what they were feeling was possible. A professor of agricultural science at the University of Nebraska wrote to Sigrid in 1891, requesting detailed specifications. She sent him a 4-page letter in her careful English, describing every measurement and material and principle she had learned from her grandmother. The professor published the letter in full in his department's bulletin, with a note stating that the practical builder in Wyoming, whose experience during the Great Die-Up of 1886 to 1887 constituted the most convincing evidence available for the superiority of natural fiber insulation in agricultural structures. He did not know her first name. He referred to her throughout the note as the Widow Weston. She did not mind. The wool did not need anyone to know her name in order to work. Sigrid Montrose Zimmermann died in 1918 at the age of 66 in the same house she had built in stages over 30 years on the 60 acres she had claimed in 1885. She was buried on a small rise overlooking the creek near the foundations of the sod dugout where she had spent her first Wyoming summer, learning what the country would and would not give her. James carved her marker himself from a piece of bighorn limestone. Sigrid Montrose Zimmermann, 1852 to 1918. Mother, builder, friend to cold weather animals. The barn outlasted her. It was still standing in 1936 when her youngest daughter sold the ranch and moved to Casper. And a photograph of it appeared that year in a Wyoming Agricultural Extension Bulletin as an example of pioneer construction still serving its original purpose a half-century after it was built. The barn in the photograph looks exactly like what it is, a modest rectangular structure with a low-pitched roof and deep eaves, nothing about its exterior suggesting what its walls contain or what they have held season after season against the long Wyoming cold. The barn was torn down in 1942. A new owner wanted the space for a tractor shed, and the old structures stood in the way of progress, which is what old structures eventually do. The men who did the demolition pried off the outer sheathing and found the wool. More than 1,200 pounds of it packed into the wall, cavities 56 years earlier, by a woman with a flat wooden paddle and the knowledge her grandmother had pressed into her hands on a summer morning in a country across the ocean. The fleece was still soft, still pliable, still carrying faintly but unmistakably the smell of lanolin. 56 years in the dark, and the wool had not rotted, had not powdered, had not lost the quality that had made it worth carrying halfway across the world and packing into the walls of a barn that everyone told her not to build. The fiber remembered. It was doing in 1942 what it had been doing since 1886, holding still air against the world, performing the function it had been given, without requiring anyone to believe in it. The demolition crew took armloads of it home. Small pieces of that original fleece were passed from hand to hand in Powder River households for the next 30 years, kept in glass jars on mantelpieces, brought out on winter evenings to show to visitors. And every time someone held a piece of that wool and turned it in the light and breathed in the faint ghost of sheep and lanolin, they were told a story. About the Norwegian widow who came to Wyoming with a wool comb and a satchel of seeds. About the barn that every rancher in the territory called a coffin for sheep. About the winter that killed more than 1.5 million cattle and left the high plains silent in a way they had not been before and would not be again. About the walls that held. About the animals that lived. About the boy who laughed at her and stayed to learn. About the woman who knew, because her grandmother had taught her and her grandmother's grandmother before that the cold does not negotiate and that only your physics answers it, and that a wall full of still air between you and a Wyoming winter is the difference between a herd in the spring and an empty pasture full of silence. The wool held that truth for 56 years in the dark and gave it back unchanged. That is what wool does. That is what it has always done. And somewhere in the long memory of the Finnmark Plateau, an old woman presses a young girl's hand against a warm wall and waits for the child to feel what the wool is doing, and the child feels it, and the old woman says, "Now you know." Not believe. No. The cold does not negotiate. Only your physics answers it.